Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the new Sigma 35mm F1.2 DG Mark II Art Series lens. Now, the predecessor of this lens I reviewed back in 2019, I believe, and so 6 years have gone by since the release of that lens. It was actually one of Sigma's earliest dedicated, what they called DN at the time, or designed for mirrorless designs, and ironically, it came out in conjunction with the 45mm F2.8, the first of their I-series lenses, a really small, compact lens, and then there was this massive 35mm lens. And I remember writing in my review at that point that this was the most Sigma of lenses, in that it was optically excellent, but it was huge and it was heavy, and that was obviously a real limiting factor for a lot of people. Sigma has a different philosophy in 2025 where they recognize it's not enough just to be optically strong, which they've developed a brand for, but now it's equally important to try to shave some of that weight, reduce the size down, and make lenses, even if they're going to be these extreme type designs with maximum apertures of f1.2, but the kind of lens that people might actually want to bring along. So this Mark II lens, it's 20% shorter, it's 30% lighter, and now it is really competitively sized in weight in a form factor that's actually almost identical, at least in length, to their 35mm f1.4 lens. But is this lens worth having? Earlier this year, we had the excellent Viltrox 35mm f1.2 from their lab series, and so is Sigma able to bring something extra to market that the lab didn't bring? And does it justify what actually becomes the premium lens in the 35mm class here on Sony? At $1,549, that's more expensive than the Sony G Master lens, though the G Master is just an f1.4 lens, and obviously considerably more expensive than what the Viltrox lab is. So in today's review, we're going to try to explore all of that and determine whether or not this is the lens that you should desire if you're looking for a high-end 35mm prime for either Sony E-mount or Leica L-mount. We'll dive into it right after a word from our sponsor. Today's episode is sponsored by the all-new Fantom Tracker 2.0. Fantom has not only seriously upgraded the visual look of the card, but now we have a superior build quality made with tempered glass and metal alloys. This credit card size tracker can be locally tracked via a 90 decibel beeping noise, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My Network and its map. The addition of NFC means that you can also use the card to trigger an automation. Just tap it. The tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and assures you won't lose your valuables. It has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge can last up to 6 months. The Fantom Tracker 2.0 makes for a seriously cool gift, so visit store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 at checkout for 20% off. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 for 20% off. So in full disclosure, this lens was loaned to me by Sigma. However, they have had no input in this review, and my findings are my own. As always, this is a completely independent review. So I've had a unique opportunity during this review to have a couple of key comparison points, including the Sony 35mm f1.4 GM, which I've owned for a few years, and then the more recent Viltrox Lab 35mm f1.2. Sigma is putting here in between the two, and that's basically where it falls in terms of its size and weight. Now, the original lens from Sigma was actually larger even than the lab, larger and heavier. And so this new lens is 20% shorter, it is 30% lighter, and you can see in this comparison image just how it falls out compared to both the original 35mm f1.2 and then also Sigma's own 35mm f1.4. So that plays out as being 81 millimeters in diameter, or 3.2 inches, and 111.4 millimeters, or 4.4 inches in overall length. So to give you an idea, that is almost exactly what the length of the 35mm f1.4 art is, but this f1.2 lens is about 5.5 millimeters wider in diameter to accommodate that additional glass in there. The old lens, by comparison, was 87.8 millimeters in diameter, so plus 6.8 millimeters compared to this lens, but it was a whopping 136.2 millimeters in length, which is nearly 25 additional millimeters in length. So that is a huge difference. Now, the Viltrox Lab lens, just to give you an idea, it is 89.2 millimeters in diameter, and so it's quite wide, about 8 millimeters wider in diameter, and it is longer by about right over 10 millimeters. It's 121.8 millimeters. In this process of condensing down the size, Sigma has also managed to reduce the filter size down to 72 millimeters. I believe from 82 millimeters was the original on the previous lens. And so that's a significant reduction in size for the filters. So now this lens weighs in at 755 grams. That's 26.6 ounces. Compared to 910 grams for the Lab Series lens. The original lens was right under 1,100 grams, and so they've shaved off a lot of size of weight. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room is that Sony's 35mm f1.4 G Master, it doesn't have the same maximum aperture, obviously, but it is considerably more compact than the f1.2 lenses. And so if you can live with f1.4, it remains a really stellar choice because you're not going to get a better quality lens in this form factor at 35 millimeters. It really is a fantastic lens. Now, this new lens has Sigma's more robust approach to feature set compared to the previous lens, and so that includes a more complex approach to the aperture control. You can have clicks at 1/3 stop to tenths, but there is a declick option here that allows you to smoothly move through it, and so you can do smooth aperture racks for video. Very useful on that front. On this other side, there is an iris lock that will allow you to either lock into or out of the manual aperture ring. And so if you don't like aperture rings at all, no problem, just lock into the automatic mode and you don't have to worry about it. Or if you always want to use the aperture ring and you don't want to inadvertently go into automatic mode, you can use that aperture lock to take care of that. Other features here include a focus hold button and AF/MF switch, and so you have quick control for that. And I will note on that point that I love the fact that on Sigma lenses, you do have full-time manual override, and so that's really useful, and we'll talk a little bit more about that during the autofocus section. While we're here, the manual focus ring here, it moves very smoothly, which is not unusual on mirrorless lenses. However, it does have a decent amount of damping, and the focus motors are nice and reactive, and so there's no input lag, and so manual focus experience really is quite good. The aperture iris has 11 blades, so it keeps a nicely circular shape. I'll go through that aperture rack one more time so you can see it does maintain a nice circular shape, and the geometry is pretty good, and definitely by f2, you have consistently round specular highlights all across the frame, even a little bit before that, and so very nice on that front. We do have Sigma's dust and moisture resistance gasket at the back of the lens, coating on the front element, and then seals throughout at all of the rings and switches. And so it is a thoroughly weather sealed lens there. It does come with a nice hood here. Sigma's hoods are typically a cut above, and so there are some different textures on there. There is a locking button that allows you to make sure it's never going to inadvertently come free there. Really nicely implemented, and I would say that it's even a bit nicer than what you're going to find on the G Master lens. Minimum focus distance is 28 centimeters, and so that allows you to get relatively close to your subject. And you get a 0.19 times level of magnification. So that's a little bit better than the Viltrox, 0.17 times, not quite as good as the Sony, 0.26 times. It's one of the areas where the Sony lens is a standout. But 0.19 times is very useful for a lot of things. And as you can see of the lens on the front of the old SLR, you can fill a pretty good part of the frame with that. So I find that to be very useful. Now, it is interesting and unusual for a Sigma lens to actually be the most expensive in this particular class, at least on Sony. And that plays out because Sony itself does not have an f1.2 option. It only has an f1.4 option. And so the Sony's MSRP is right under $1,500, whereas the Sigma is $1,550. Now, at the moment, because it's been on the market for a while, you may have some play in that with the Sony lens right now at B&H Photo. This is $100 off, and so it's playing more at the $1,400 range rather than the $1,500 range. And I know for many of you around the world, when a new Sigma lens releases, an older G Master lens may actually be cheaper already in the market compared to that. The value option here is the lab lens, which MSRP's at about $1,000, but there's discount codes, including one in the description down below, if you want to jump in and get that for even less. And so obviously it is the value king here, as is pretty traditional space for the Viltrox. And so this is the premium lens in the class, but it is also premium in performance. And to give you a little bit more of a head-to-head perspective, this isn't available on Nikon Z mount, but if you compare it to the Nikkor 35 f1.2 S-line lens, that lens retails for about $3,000, almost twice the cost of this. That helps put things into perspective a little bit. All told, this is another nicely executed package from Sigma. No real complaints here. So let's talk autofocus. Sigma has elected for the second time here to have an autofocus design that uses two of their new HLA focus motors. That stands for a high-speed linear actuator, and this, along with the 135mm f1.4, are the first of Sigma's lenses to employ two focus motors to get the job done. Now obviously this is going to give a huge advantage over the first generation lens that employed just a single STM focus motor. Now we have a lot of additional thrust, and so you can see here that focus adjustments from close to distant, if not instant, are just a hair off there. Despite the big glass elements, a part of a f1.2 design, autofocus is really fast and snappy here. Fast enough that I found in shooting sequences on my Alpha 1 of Nala, even at f1.2, that focus was good most of the time. You will see some periodic dips in those focus sequences where all of a sudden for a frame or two focus slips and then it picks back up. And so it's not flawless for sports work, and frankly, if you want to do sports type work, usually a first party Sony lens is the way to go anyway. But in this case, focus was fast enough that it kept up most of those things. For portrait work, it was flawless, as you'd probably expect at this point, having no problem nailing even at f1.2. Likewise, when just shooting general purpose type things, I had excellent autofocus, even when shooting at very narrow subjects. No problem with that. And I will give one additional bit of praise to Sigma on this front, and that is that their lenses allow for a full-time manual override, which can be really useful, I find, with all camera systems and with pretty much all lenses, that there will be moments where I want to focus on a foreground subject and the focus system, for whatever reason, just wants to keep locking on the background. And being able to just quickly manual override to get at least into the right zone, then focus will snap to where I want it to be, is a very useful thing. So in general, I found that autofocus performance was excellent. Again, there are a few limitations when it comes to sports type applications, but outside of that, you're going to be delighted with the kind of autofocus results you can get. It's fast, it's quiet, and it is very accurate in operation. So how about autofocus for video? Now, I've shot all of these outdoor segments all on this lens. And in this particular shot, I have set it up intentionally with a few layers in the foreground, some things that might potentially distract on autofocus. But as you've probably seen at this point in all of these segments, focus has no problem locking onto a static subject like myself. And so zero issues with things like that. Likewise, I noticed when I did my test of focus pulls back and forth, a couple of things. First of all, those focus pulls, they're confident, they move smoothly back and forth, no pulsing or settling. But also I noted a relatively low amount of focus breathing. Certainly less so, for example, if I throw on the Viltrox Lab, there's a much more obvious amount of focus breathing. And of course, the other lens that I'm benchmarking in this series is the Sony 35mm f1.4 GM. And the Sony GM lens is pretty notorious for the amount of focus breathing it has. Now, the Sony does benefit from the ability of being able to use focus breathing compensation in camera to correct for that, which is reserved only for Sony lenses. However, when there's a significant amount of focus breathing, as there is with this lens, it means that it's coming at a pretty noticeable amount of crop to achieve that. And so I actually prefer what Sigma's done here in that the focus breathing is primarily solved from within the actual lens itself. And they've done that by employing some floating elements as a part of the design, and so that helps there to be less issues with focus breathing. I also found when doing my hand test, no problem in going back and forth as far as my hand. And I did notice in my static shots or then in my slow pans or different movement shots that focus moved along just fine, no issues there. And the only place where I saw any issue that I can report is that if I was zooming in towards a subject and I got into that close range as I moved closer to it, I did find some slippage, as you can see here, where focus kind of gets off and then it catches back up again and gets to the place where it needs to be. And I saw a couple of those cycles in that particular clip there. And so it's not flawless, but at the same time, it is very, very good. And most of all, I find it very dependable. I don't have any kind of concerns at this moment that focus isn't doing what I want it to do, even though I have introduced these layers into the shot and I'm shooting at f1.2. It's pretty fantastic in that regard. So no real reservations when it comes to the autofocus performance for video either. So let's talk image quality. Optical design here is pretty complex. 17 elements in 13 groups, the same as the new 135 f1.4. In this case, though, the exotic elements are different. We have 4 spherical elements and 1 SLD element to achieve what is a really good optical performance. Sigma chose to benchmark their first generation 35 f1.2. You can see that the new lens, despite being much smaller and lighter, still manages to beat the old lens all across the frame. Very impressive that they've been able to, their ability to grind new and unique exotic elements allows them to condense things down. So that's really fantastic. If I look and compared, and I did my typical lining up with the MTF chart for the Lab Series lens, across the first half of the frame, so from center to mid frame, Viltrox has a very slight edge, and then there's some give and take with the corners being very slightly better for the Sigma lens. I found that in real world shooting that I felt like there was a very slight edge in micro contrast for the Viltrox in the center of the frame. But again, yes, the corners looked a little bit better on the Sigma. This does really well when it comes to distortion. That's an area that sometimes I have critiques of Sigma's wider angle lenses, but that's not a problem here. There's the tiniest amount of pincushion distortion, but just a -1 corrects that. Vignette is relatively heavy. It's a +73 to correct, and so that's right in the same ballpark as the Viltrox lens. Big, wide angle, wide aperture. Now, unfortunately, it comes with some vignette in the territory. You will notice that in some shots, as you can see here. However, you stop down and it will start to go away, and Sigma does get excellent correction profile support, either in camera and in third-party software. I found very low instances of longitudinal style chromatic aberrations and no real visible lateral style chromatic aberrations either. So no problem on that front. All those aberrations are well controlled. If we take a look at resolution, we can find even on a 61 megapixel A7R Mark V at 200% magnification that the center looks really good, that the mid frame looks really good, and then the corners are a little bit less good, but still very usable. And as we move on past there, as you stop down to f1.4, you see some mild gains to contrast. And then at f2, more still, and the corners are looking better. By f2.8, it is pin sharp all across the frame, including right off until the very edges of the corners. That means that your landscape style shots are going to look really, really good, and no issues with that. Diffraction is going to kick in as per usual at about f11, and it will get a little bit softer by f16, but not terrible either. I found for portrait work that portraits look fantastic even at f1.2. There's lots of sharpness and contrast there. And again, if we take a quick look comparing at f1.2 to the Viltrox, they look very, very similar. If I compare to the Sony at f1.4, again, they look very, very similar, but you will notice the background is definitely softer looking from the Sigma lens, and there's just more noticeable circles, kind of bubble effect with the bokeh balls on the Sony lens, and so definitely a smoother rendering. And I did find when it comes to the bokeh that it was, in my opinion, a little bit smoother from the Sigma lens than what it was from the Viltrox, both in the foreground, as you can see here, a little bit more jittery from the Viltrox, and then even in the background, I felt like the Sigma produced just slightly softer looking results. And so really good on that front. The bokeh in general, I mean, some lenses I have just this really magical quality to them. I don't know that I feel that about the rendering from this particular lens, but then again, when I compare it with other lenses that I think are also quite good, it seems to be a little bit better than them. So as far as f1.2 lenses go, this is really nice. I will say that I think that the rendering from the Nikkor 35 f1.2 S line is nicer, but again, twice the money. So overall, good results there. I also found when doing testing for flare that flare is mostly good. You're going to see a little bit of a veiling flare effect if the light source is right out of the frame at wide apertures, but it's fairly artistic. I did note that when stopped down to small apertures, f11, that it got a little bit more distracting, a little bit more ghosting, and then also something in the bottom of the frame, which wasn't there at wider apertures. And so, I think a lot of the times you're going to be shooting maybe at wider apertures anyway, so it's maybe not a real world problem, but just so you're aware of that. I think in most cases you can shoot a backlit subject without any kind of major problems there. At the end of the day, optics here are really, really good, competitive with the very best. And I don't know, what more could you ask for? They've shrunk the size, dropped the weight way down, and made it optically better than what it was before. Sounds like a winning combo to me. So my conclusion is that while the Sigma is the most expensive lens in the class, at least here on Sony, in many ways I think it is the best lens here in the class. There might be a mild edge for the Sony lens when it comes to overall focus speed and consistency of focus if you're shooting in sporting type situations. And maybe the Viltrox has a very slight edge in certain applications when it comes to the image quality, maybe a bit more micro contrast. But the Sigma, it takes all the best elements and puts them together in one lens. It is not the smallest or lightest lens in the class. That would be the Sony, but it's only an f1.4 lens. And for a 35mm f1.2, this is as small and light as what we have seen. And so they've done a great job in both miniaturizing the lens while also not only retaining but improving on that optical performance. The fact that we now have excellent autofocus, we already had a great build and feature set, means that this is a lens that is pretty much doing everything well. And if I could put it this way, if I were choosing a 35mm lens in this class right now to purchase, I think I probably would go with the Sigma, and I may in fact do that and upgrade to it in the future because I feel like it is providing the best of all the worlds at the moment. And so you can tell that this is a second generation lens because it has that extra degree of polish that Sigma has managed to bring to bear. You can tell that Sigma has learned some lessons over the past 6 years since they made the first generation lens, and it shows in just the degree of polish in all these different areas where the lens is just better than what it's ever been before. And as I went through a lot of head-to-head tests, and yes, I will release a head-to-head video where I do some comparisons between the Sony, the Viltrox, and the Sigma lens, I came away feeling that the Sigma really delivered the consistently best performance of those three lenses, and we'll break that on down in a future video. So while it's not cheap at $1,549 US, it does provide, I think, a very strong value. And if you go outside of the platform for a moment and you compare it to a lens like the Nikon 35mm f1.2 S-line lens, that S-line lens is an amazing, amazing lens. However, the Sigma, I think, is pretty much matching it and at a price tag of well under $1,000 cheaper. And so I think that helps to position it as being a really strong value. Now, if you want more information, you can check out my full text review, which is linked in the description down below on the newly redesigned DustinAbbott.net. Go check that out. And if you're one of those that wants the deep dive into the optics, stay tuned with me right now. Let's jump into that together. Okay, we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. You can see that distortion is very well controlled, not really hardly anything to see. I did dial in a -1 here to correct just the tiniest amount of pincushion distortion. Vignette is much more the issue here, requiring a +73 to get to the correction that you see here. Correction profiles will help with that. However, if you do not correct it, you will definitely see some vignette in the corners. It will darken the image and give it a specific look. You can see that while longitudinal style chromatic aberrations aren't perfectly corrected in my chart here. There's a little bit before and a little bit after. And what I found when taking a look here at the SLR here at the front, you can see that there's very little fringing. There's a tiny bit in there. And then as we move towards past the plane of focus, you can see that there is basically no fringing showing up there. Nothing around the specular highlights. Pretty nice and clean there. Lateral style chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame are zero problem. You can see everything is very, very nice and clean in the transitions from black to white there. So taking a look at resolution and contrast, again, 61 megapixels, 200% magnification level. You can see here in the center of the frame, looks fantastic. High contrast, great detail, all good there. Mid-frame looks awesome as well, no problems there. Looks good on this side. As we pop on down here, we can see starting to get a little bit of drop off here towards the lower right. And as we move towards the corners, it is a bit softer, but really not too bad, holding up fairly well here. Now I'm going to reserve most of my comparisons for the follow-up video between the Viltrox and the Sony and then this Sigma lens. But if we just do a very quick f1.2 comparison, we can see that the Viltrox has very slightly more contrast in the center of the frame, just a little bit more punch there. In the mid-frame, they are close, though I think Viltrox still has a very slight edge there. As we move down towards the corners, there's a bit of give and take here, but I would say that the Sigma looks a little bit cleaner to me, a little bit more definition in some of these areas. And so you can see that both lenses, they're competitive. The Viltrox maybe has the very slightest edge in terms of just raw resolution and contrast. There's absolutely plenty here at f1.2 for shooting portrait work, and so if we zoom in here, you can see that on my face that there's lots of detail there. You really wouldn't be looking for anything more than that. I would say contrast looks very nice. Overall, the rendering of the shot looks nice. Another shot here, just quickly, you can see that focus is doing a great job. And fortunately, even at f1.2 at 35 millimeters, there's enough in focus that you actually get a nice look of the face. I would say that the overall dimensionality here looks pretty good from the background, and I just have a single fixed light here that is providing the fill light. Overall, I would say it looks good. Now, if we stop down to f1.4, just that little bit of stop down, you can see there is a bit more contrast. I would say that you can see a little bit more popping up here in terms of textures in the mid-frame. The corners, this is not where I see a big corner jump. The corners look a little bit brighter and higher contrast, but not a lot of additional detail yet. If we return to a portrait setting for a moment, you can see that there probably is just a little bit more contrast like around the eyes area. But again, I wouldn't say that it is meaningful enough for you to really notice much of a difference. It looks good, but it looked good at f1.2 as well. There's a bit more contrast at f2, as you can see here. Everything in like the mid-frame zone, all of that's looking really good. The corners are looking better. However, you can see from f2 to f2.8 is really where the corners really start to pop. And you can see how the contrast is really standing out now. If I pop up here into the upper left corner, you can see that at f2.8, it just looks a lot better than what it did at f2. So that means when you're shooting at landscape apertures, this one is at f4, but anywhere between f2.8 and f8, you're going to get really fantastic results all across the frame. You can see there's tons of detail and contrast there. The colors pop. The image just looks really, really good generally. And so certainly lots of performance for landscapes, or if you're shooting portraits and you just want more in focus, it's going to give you tremendous amounts of detail. Now by f11, you'll get a bit of softening due to diffraction. By f16, obviously that is more prominent. Still usable, but definitely not as sharp as what we saw at other aperture values. Going back to minimum focus distance for a moment, I'll give you a look at how the performance is here. You can see even at f1.2, there's good detail and contrast up close. This lens does have floating elements, so yes, that does mean you'll feel like things are moving around a little bit if you shake it when the lens is off the camera or the camera's turned off, but it's mild in this case. It's not going to be really obvious, but it definitely helps with that up-close performance to get a flatter plane of focus and to get better detail. And so it is able to deliver a really high level of of, I shouldn't say super high level of magnification, but a very usable level of magnification that will allow you to strongly blur out backgrounds. Speaking of the bokeh quality, you can see in this shot, I think this one is handled really well. It has, something closer to that magical rendering that I'm looking for, great detail on the subject. This shot I actually really, really like. I think that the background is handled nicely, and then the subject looks fantastic, really holding up nicely even though it's backlit. Now, on the flare front, this is what you're likely to get if you're shooting at f1.2 and you have a bright light source either in the frame or right out. It is a little bit of kind of a glow that's there. I personally like this. I think it's very artistic, very usable. Here's another shot here, and some of this bokeh is a little bit busy for me, but I think overall the subject is holding up well. Fringing is well controlled in that very difficult situation, and only the tiniest little bit of ghosting bits. This shot you can see here, and here we can see the sequence. So here's at f1.2. You can just see basically that bit of glow there. At f5.6, you're starting to get more defined look at the aperture blades, but also more of this kind of green impact, a little bit more ghosting here. But then when you stop down to f11, you can see here that this is where it's not so pretty. And there's, more obvious prismatic haze up here, but more concerning is down here where you're getting a lot of this green blobs of color. And that ghosting could be a significant issue. So I would say if you're shooting in backlit subjects, you're going to be better if you keep it at f5.6 or brighter. And if you stop it on down, you could potentially run into some issues that might be a problem for you. This shot here, while it's at that smaller aperture, it is kind of filtered through the trees. And so, yes, there's a little bit of the ghosting pattern here, but not much of an issue. So that's a more usable type situation. So I think that if you use a little bit of discretion in the way that you compose and how you set your shot up, you'll have no problems. And if you're shooting at wide apertures, no problem at all. Overall, this is a great optical performance. So hopefully the deep dive helped you to determine whether or not this was the lens for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.